Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. I'm Damian Murphy, Senior Vice President in the National Security and International Policy Program here at CAP, and I'm so glad that you could join us here today. The goal of CAP's Path Forward series is to lift up voices who aren't merely standing against the chaos and corruption of the Trump administration, but who are actively offering principled, pragmatic alternatives to move this country and the world forward. Today, we're honored to be joined by someone who's doing just that, Congressman Jason Crow. Congressman Crow is helping to shape what a responsible, ethical, and future-focused U.S. foreign policy should look like. At a moment when American leadership is being dangerously undermined, his voice is urgently needed. As Trump and his allies have hollowed out our institutions, sold out long-standing alliances, and blurred the lines between national interests and personal gain, Congressman Crow has made his stance clear. Foreign policy should serve the public interest, not the private interests of those in power. As a former Army Ranger who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Congressman brings firsthand understanding of the consequences of America's choices overseas. In Congress, he's used that perspective to push for smarter, more accountable engagement in the world. As a leader on the House Armed Services, Intelligence, and previously Foreign Affairs committees, he has worked to stand up for our allies when they are threatened, to reduce civilian harm in conflict zones, and ensure American military power is used appropriately. Today, he is here to discuss his new foreign policy framework, an effort to reimagine America's role in the world in a way that reflects our values and honors our commitments. This vision could not come at a more critical time. Whether it's defending democracy in Ukraine, working to find a path forward in Gaza or Sudan, or standing by our Afghan allies, Congressman Crow has been at the front lines of making sure that our foreign policy reflects who we should be as Americans. He believes in diplomacy backed by strength, partnerships built on trust, and a foreign policy grounded in transparency, democratic accountability, and human dignity. So please join me in welcoming a public servant, a veteran, and a leading voice on foreign affairs, Congressman Jason Crow.
Thank you, Damian, and the Center for American Progress. I see that you denied my request for an enormous flag backdrop. Sorry, I can't resist sometimes. It's just too easy. I've been on Capitol Hill for 7 years now in this job, on the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Intelligence Committee, have led the Bipartisan Veterans Caucus, the Army Caucus. I've done a lot of work in this field. But all of this policy has always brought me back to the start of my career as a teenager when I first raised my right hand and took an oath to this country, and at that point was Private Crow, the lowest ranking person you can be in the military. I was at the very receiving end of all the policy that's made here in this town. Since that time, from Private Crow to Congressman Crow, the world indeed has been turned upside down. All that we had assumed and taken for granted has been thrown into question. The biggest divide that I see right now and how we view this problem is those who believe that Donald Trump is the cause of it versus those who believe that Donald Trump is a symptom of it. And that requires looking back over the last 30 years and looking at it through the lens of the people that I grew up with in a working class town in the upper Midwest, those who I fought with, and those who I now serve. In those last 30 years, we've had over 20 years of failed military interventions, $3 trillion, 3 million combat tours, over 7,000 of our own dead, tens of thousands of others dead. And what's not in those numbers is the unequal burden that was borne by the working class. What I learned as a young man is that when people pound their chest and bang the war drums in Washington, D.C., and talk about going to do tough things, they're not talking about themselves. They're talking about young kids from towns many of us haven't heard of that have to pick up rifles, jump into helicopters, get inside tanks, and do the tough stuff. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening, the middle class was gutted. NAFTA and free trade and neoliberal economic policies that were supposed to deliver for everybody, raised the water for all boats, delivered instead disproportionate impacts. The industrial portions of our country were left behind in many trade deals and automation. Also, we had a pandemic that shattered Americans' sense of safety. And once again, the impact felt disproportionately. You know, it's one thing to jump on a Zoom if you're in a white-collar office job. But most of the people that I represent couldn't do that. They're in service industry, construction, healthcare. And they lost their jobs or had to show up anyway. Also, meanwhile, we have a surging China that is competing against us and outcompeting us in many key ways, and the largest land war in Europe. All of this to say that the veil has been pierced. And the last decade of elections have made something very clear. Americans simply no longer trust the foreign policy establishment in this country. And they shouldn't, because it's actually failed them in so many remarkable ways. So this isn't predominantly a policy discussion. It's a discussion about trust, about where we are now, but how we're going to restore trust to get back to having policy discussions with the people that we're supposed to serve. Because what is very clear, again, is that America wants something very different. I believe that the way that we answer 4 key questions will determine whether or not people will trust us again and give us the opportunity to serve. The first question you should ever ask a member of Congress before they ever start talking about foreign policy is, are you willing to reclaim your foreign policy powers? Our founders believed that Congress had a fundamental role in our foreign policy, from trade to treaties, to war powers, and to appropriations. For decades, Congress has ceded and given up many of those powers. Our founders knew that these things were too important to be entrusted simply to the executive, because it needed accountability to those closest to the people. And there's no one closer to the people than members of Congress, who have to go home every weekend and stand before their constituents and answer questions. We saw, over the last 25 years, Congress giving blank checks to presidents. Republican and Democratic Congresses did it, and they did it to Republican and Democratic presidents across the board. Nobody here can ever tell me that our 25 years of failed foreign military interventions would have ended differently or sooner had members of Congress been forced regularly to go to high school gymnasiums, Rotary clubs, and any other organization in their community and explain why Americans should give their sons and daughters to war efforts and billions of their hard-earned dollars. It absolutely would have ended differently. So any member of Congress must be willing to repeal and replace our AUMFs and reinsert itself in our trade and treaty powers. Because if you're concerned about the bombing of Iran, the bombing of the Houthis, the strikes in the Caribbean, well, Congress is letting that happen. If you think that our counterterrorism strategy in Africa has largely failed, well, Congress could change that. And if you're troubled by the weaponization of our National Guard across our country, and our president claiming to go to war with the American people, well, Congress could stop that too. So no member of Congress can legitimately talk about foreign policy unless they're willing to take that first step. The second question, are we willing to follow our own rules? Americans believe in rules. This town loves to talk about the rules-based international order. First of all, nobody outside this town really understands what that means. But secondly, a lot of Americans just think it's bullshit. Not the rules, but our unequal application and our inconsistency in following those rules. I saw very clearly when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, us making deals with warlords and strongmen. I know our history of aligning at times with autocrats because we want to keep oil prices low. We make short-term decision after short-term decision that undermines our credibility and our ability to actually go to the world and make the case. And frankly, there is no more vivid example than the split screen between Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza war. Ukraine, a just war, a country fighting for its survival and its sovereignty, that merited our involvement and still does. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. While at the same time, us supporting and not being willing to apply our own rules to a war that brought over 60,000 civilian casualties in the Middle East and in Gaza. This town loves to talk about IHL, LOAC, National Security Memorandum 20, the Conventional Arms Transfer Treaty or policy, Leahy vetting. These are all tools that could work, that would work, if we actually are willing to apply our own standards and live by them. Americans do indeed want rules to avoid chaos and consistency, and it starts with following them ourselves. The third question, are you willing to take on corruption seriously, both at home and abroad? The Trump administration has rapidly become the most corrupt in American history. Donald Trump is personalizing American power for the benefit of his family and a handful of associates. He has become a predatory pawn shop dealer looking to cut a deal with the next desperate customer who walks through the door. Imposing tariffs on Brazil to support an ally. $20 billion bailout for Argentina. Pakistan giving a golf course deal for favorable treatment. Hotel deals around the world, too countless to even mention today. Jets in exchange for security deals, and on and on. All while billions flow into meme coins from unknown foreign investors directly into the pocket of Donald Trump and the Trump family. Trump's doctrine is simple. It's pay to play for tech oligarchs and strongmen, all of whom will support each other and steal our democracy and our self-determination from us, so that only they will control politics, the economy, technology, information, and our daily lives. An ambitious anti-corruption agenda at home and abroad must be our second-order priority behind recapturing war powers. And if members of Congress aren't willing to be serious about that, then they can't be taken seriously by all of you. The next and final question is, are we willing to open the door to new talent? When I worked in construction to help put my way through college, you'd start every day with a handshake. But what that handshake actually was a callus check. You're feeling somebody's hands and asking yourself, are they one of me? Are they one of us? Because more so than how smart you are or what you may know, people want to be able to trust you. It is just true that our foreign policy and national security system has become too insular and out of touch. We cannot run a system that's responsive and seen by the American people as responsive to their needs if it's with the same people who have gone to the same 3 colleges, most of whom live within 50 miles of an ocean. This town loves its policy dinners, its saloons, its retreats, its nice trips. And when I first came to Congress and I started to go to these salons and these dinners, it didn't take me very long to realize it was the same people saying many of the same things. Americans simply don't see themselves in their leadership anymore. It must reflect not only who we are, but how we think. Our ability to turn this around will be directly related to our ability to tap into the talent that this entire country has to offer. And that means mentoring programs. That means reaching into high schools and colleges around the country. It means changing radically our security clearance system so people with actual lived experience can still qualify for important jobs. And it also means creating a diplomacy and national security system that requires, for advancement, regular tours in the United States to conduct public diplomacy, to go to Kansas City and run a World Affairs Council, to go to Denver and help organize civic organizations focused on the global economy. A lot has happened in my almost 7 years in Congress, but it all comes back to my time as an Arby's cashier, a construction worker, a paratrooper, and a ranger. In all of those cases, people simply wanted to trust you first. Most of these folks have lost faith in this town, and rightfully so. I share much of that anger and frustration. There is so much that we must do, but we will never be given the chance to do any of it unless we prove that we are willing to build an entirely new system based on fundamental principles. Thank you.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for that tour de force. I think it really helps us to sharpen our focus as we're looking at a host of foreign policy and national security issues. Gives us that framework to think about the kinds of questions that we should be asking and the framework through which we should come up with answers. I'd like to start with the role of Congress. And you talked about the importance of taking a hard look at the AUMFs that are on the books right now, and repealing those when their expiration date really hits in terms of policy. I was always struck, working in the Senate for over a decade, and traveling to places like Germany, who we were working very closely with in Afghanistan, right, in the NATO force there. And the Bundestag every year would have to take an affirmative vote on whether or not they should maintain their troop presence in Germany, right? So it wasn't just a vote that was clouded within a broader budget and, kind of part of a bigger package, but it was like an explicit vote on whether or not the troops should stay. And every year, for over the course of those 19 or 20 years, they would do it, right? And I would sit there and think to myself, if we had that same vote in the United States Congress, would we still be in this country, right? 2005, 2006, 2007. And, the answer to that question is probably no, right? So
yeah, it is probably no.
So I think what you're describing in terms of Congress ceding authority to an executive branch has really been a dynamic that we've seen, since 9/11, and something that, folks in the national security community would agree is a problem. But I guess it would be interesting to hear from your sort of inside perspective, what are the obstacles to Congress taking more control, right? I mean, it's a decision, but what are the obstacles?
Well, right now, one of the biggest obstacles is Donald Trump's capture of his political party, and most folks in the party being unwilling to oppose that and exercise their independent constitutional obligations. right? And why I say that is because I know, I'm one of the most bipartisan members of Congress, by the way, right? I'm always in the top 10. Over 70% of my legislation, historically, I've introduced with a Republican co-lead. I talk to my colleagues a lot. And why I mention that as the first question is because I also think it's the most attainable in building a bipartisan coalition around. There are folks on the right and the left who fundamentally believe this must happen. But it's a lack of political courage. And that's why I'm trying to also frame it as the first step. Because if everywhere people go, they're not taken seriously unless they're willing to say, I'm willing to hold and recapture my own power, then that actually will create momentum, I think, that we need to get it done.
In terms of the Trump administration, I mean, the Senate itself hasn't done treaties in a long time, right? I think the last major one was probably New START in 2010. But you've seen so many moves just in these past 10 months of things that would otherwise be treaties, right? And a good example is this, basically the security guarantee that he signed with Qatar. That would have been a treaty in a normal environment. And the fact that that sort of thing can happen and no one sort of blinks an eye and it just goes ahead without any real pushback from Congress is notable. Maybe if I could turn to...
And can I also say, I mean, I always have a magic wand answer to when I say... I'm often asked if I could do only one thing, if I could wave a magic wand and my career would be over, what would it be? And without a doubt, it is gerrymandering reform. Because we talk about any impediment to big things within Congress and the fact that only 10%, fewer than 10% of districts are now competitive anymore, right? They're either deep blue or deep red. There's no incentive to do something big like war powers reform because people can just sit in their seats and win re-election, right? Like you actually want to start doing things like that and create an accountability loop in gerrymandering.
Yeah, well, and I think you see it in the Senate as well, where, a decade ago, 15 or so years ago, you would have these members from purple states who would have to be able to speak to both sides and garner support on both sides. And they were kind of the glue of the institution. And now there are maybe 2 of those left, back when there were like 15, back in the day. Turning to your second big question to focus on, following the rules. You've done some really impressive and innovative work with respect to civilian harm and protection of civilians abroad in conflict environments. How did your experience as a ranger in Iraq and Afghanistan inform that work?
It's the reason for that work. When I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, it didn't take me long to realize that our counterinsurgency and counterterrorism policies and approach, our tactics, were undermining the support of the people that we were there to help. Very clearly, right? I made reference in my remarks to, the deals we've cut with warlords and strongmen, and how we ignored very obvious signs about the will of the people and corruption, and what people wanted in Iraq and Afghanistan. We ignored it. It was there for us to see. And on top of that was the civilian casualty piece. I saw how the impact of civilian casualties on not only public support and will, but extremism, right? I just know, it's everybody who's been in combat knows, that if you kill someone's son, daughter, husband, father, wife, it doesn't matter, like anybody, you're creating more extremism. Right? We're creating more of a problem than you're solving. That's not even the moral component of it. That's just the mathematical answer to that. So that led me to create and co-found in my first term the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus that has legislated and helped lead in Congress efforts to center the protection of civilians in our own operations and to create a center of excellence in the Department of Defense that would serve as a hub for best practices and require the services to train our people the right way, to create accountability for the combatant commanders, and to actually apply our moral standards to what we're doing overseas. Of course, this administration is winding down and ending that center.
Maybe if we could turn to another issue that we focused a lot on here at the Center for American Progress, and that's the increasing politicization of the military that we're seeing these days, right? So, across the board firings of senior generals at the Pentagon, and lots of stories coming out of the building about, loyalty oaths and these sorts of practices that we've never seen before. Manipulation around intelligence and, personnel that are involved in that space. So I was wondering if you could, again, speaking to it, from the perspective of Private Crow, how you see that dynamic playing out over these past couple of months.
Having served around the world, you see how unique and special our system really is. Civilian control of the military, insulation of our military, of our troops from politics. It's extremely unique, actually, when you look at it from around the world. And it's precious, but it's also very fragile. I'm less concerned for the impact on senior commanders, because these are folks who have been around for 20, 30, 40 years and whose leadership style, whose integrity is well formed and shaped at this point, as I am on the message that is being sent to the newer troops. Mm-hmm. Those who are coming in and are in the formative stages of their careers in developing their leadership style, developing their approach to service. The message that's being sent to those younger soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines is that politics can and should be a part of your military service, and it's a dangerous message, right? So it's on us to send that counter message that that's not the way it should be, right? We can't allow that to become normalized, and Congress has a very important role in pushing back on rhetoric, but also making sure that we are recruiting across the board in this country. This administration has been very clear that they're going to try to focus on recruiting people based on politics, setting up recruiting stations at political events and other things. And Congress has a role to make sure that it's not happening.
Mm-hmm. On your fourth point around bringing new talent in, I think part of that conversation, is how we do a better job of talking to the American people. You talked about Foreign Service officers coming and doing a tour at a World Affairs Council and building that connectivity at the grassroots level. As we look back at what happened in February and March as Elon Musk was tearing through the federal bureaucracy and, in over a weekend, basically, got rid of USAID, there wasn't that domestic political pushback. So you heard from, certain members of Congress like yourself and other prominent folks who care about foreign policy up there pushing back, but there wasn't, a huge outcry from the American people. So how do we get at that issue? I think going and talking to World Affairs Council is one important step, but is there something that else we can either be doing kind of structurally or at least in terms of message that will help to, create that political support and get things like development and diplomacy resonating more with the American people?
Well, foreign policy should be directly tied to the interests of the American people. That seems obvious, but it actually is not when it actually is applied in our politics and our policy. And unless you can make a direct case as to how Americans and the working class and middle class in particular will benefit from a foreign policy, mm-hmm. then you should question whether or not we're doing it, or we should be doing it.
Yep.
Right? And I can actually make that case for a lot of things we've done in the past, right? You can make that case with humanitarian aid, with global health, with national security aid, but you actually have to apply that test, and you have to communicate it the right way, which is why, under the last administration, every time there was a supplemental in support of Ukraine, all of which I supported and would support again in an instant because they were needed, and that was a great investment of our dollars because it was nominal, actually, and had a tremendous impact. But every time there was a supplemental, the top line was, we're sending $3 billion more, $2 billion. They would just give a number. It wouldn't actually explain what it is we're doing. It wouldn't actually say, we're we're sending stuff made in Arkansas to help secure, the front lines. We have to be specific on these things, right? We just can't talk about top line numbers because that doesn't resonate with folks.
Maybe turning to a few of the regional issues that we're dealing with on the foreign policy front, maybe to start with Ukraine. You've been a leader in the Congress with respect to building and maintaining that political support for Ukraine. I remember traveling up to New England, where I'm from, not long after the war started, and seeing Ukrainian flags all over, tiny little towns in Maine and New Hampshire, right? But then going up summer after summer to visit with family, and the flags kind of fraying, right? And that's, symbolic of, how American support hasn't necessarily eroded, I would say, but, attention has gone elsewhere, right? So help us understand what at this point, what your most compelling case is for why should we remain engaged on Ukraine and continue to push for as best as an outcome possible that favors the Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's very clear. When I'll just say what I tell folks back home, my constituents, that I have an obligation to be accountable to because it's their money that's funding this, right? And what I say is, for less than 5% of our annual defense budget, we are helping an ally that we are a major trading partner with make sure that Europe remains free and secure and our number one trading partner. We are helping to secure food supplies, and we are helping to combat one of the most murderous autocratic regimes in the world, run by a man who has killed American troops and continues to threaten Americans throughout the world. And that's a damn good investment to make. And we don't have to have boots on the ground, and our own people don't need to do the fighting because we have an ally that has shown its tenacity and its strength to fight on their own for their own freedom and survival. They just want some support, and that's support that's worth giving.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting in looking at the administration's foreign policy. I mean, you mentioned a through line of corruption through all of that. There's consistency there. But one other area where there's been consistency going back to the first term is the president's perspective, shall we say, on Vladimir Putin. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that. It seems as though every time he has the last conversation with Putin, he kind of steers off from a more aggressive stance. Why do you think that is, and what do you think the administration's real goals are with respect to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think this goes to the fact that Donald Trump actually is sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. I think, his vision of what he wants to build in the world is a vision, as I outlined in my remarks, where a handful of wealthy tech oligarchs in billionaires, in people in charge of countries, legitimately or not, run the show, right? And he believes that he's in common cause with Putin on that. That is what I think is actually happening. He does not view Putin as the adversary that he is.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see as the future moving forward, especially from a congressional perspective, where, at the beginning of the war, there was very broad and deep bipartisan support. It appears as though that's eroded in some circles on the Hill. So I'm just curious, as we go into these next couple of months, what do you see as, how would you kind of characterize and frame congressional support when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, I'm not holding my breath that a lot of my colleagues are going to show the courage necessary to pressure this administration to do the right thing on Ukraine. They should, and I would welcome that. The Tomahawk cruise missile debate is part of that. There are some members of Congress who are encouraging the president to do the right thing. Honestly, where I think we are is I think Europe is going to have to take the lead in unfreezing the frozen assets and allocating that money to the war effort. That could be a game changer. They're sitting on 120 billion plus euro of frozen Russian assets. That money should be seized. It's largely in Belgium and France. That money should be seized and put into a fund to benefit not only the reconstruction and the Ukrainian people, but the ongoing war effort. That could pay for this for quite a while.
Thank you for that. Let's maybe shift to Asia. And soon the president will be traveling for the APEC meeting in South Korea. There's been talk of a meeting with President Xi. It's unclear whether or not it's going to happen yet. But it's certainly a possibility. Wondering if you can help us understand your perspective on where we are right now with respect to strategic competition. Trump talks about winning competition with China, but many of the actions of this administration have ceded global leadership, right? And we talked about the dissolution of USAID, the radios that we have, Radio Free Asia, VOA being kind of taken off the table. So much ground across sub-Saharan Africa being ceded as we don't have diplomats on the ground there. Never mind what's happened with respect to the undercutting of the innovation ecosystem that we have in our country with the universities and H-1B visas welcoming the best that are around the world and want to come here. So curious how you're seeing strategic competition from the perspective of Congress right now, whether or not there's bipartisan space there for a more serious approach.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest damage done to our effort to compete against China is to our global alliance and partnership network, right? That is our most decisive advantage. Russia and China and Iran and North Korea, they are finding more common cause and developing closer relationships, but all of them envy the most the fact that we have all of these multilateral treaties and alliances. We have a world network of friends. We almost never go it alone, historically. Mm-hmm. And it's something, and we know that they admire that because they have tried so desperately and hard to replicate it and have largely failed, right? So we are now ceding that ground. Our allies, our partners are turning away from us because the president threatens them, attempts to intimidate them, and has turned, our relationships based on reciprocity and mutual benefit into pay to play, right? Which is pushing all of our allies and our partners away. And on top of it, the tariff wars are further isolating the United States and taking away our economic power, right? Our ability to levy sanctions, which actually has broad bipartisan appeal. You poll Americans on the right and the left, and they view sanctions as one of the best, most effective tools. But we all know that sanctions only work if we're the predominant market, the dollar is strong, and people want to use our market, right? Otherwise, it does not work, by definition. Right? So we are isolating ourselves through this tariff approach, and it will not actually accomplish what Trump has told the American people it will accomplish, which is reinvigorating the American industrial base. It just won't happen.
Mm-hmm. There have been some concerns looking towards the APEC meeting that Taiwan could somehow be a bargaining chip or a topic of negotiation between Xi and Trump. Curious how you're seeing that from a congressional perspective, especially given the fact that, over the course of decades, Taiwan has enjoyed such deep bipartisan support.
Yeah, I think that continues. I do believe that Donald Trump, with him, nothing is sacred, right? He will commoditize and use anything as a bargaining chip if he thinks that it benefits, his personal agenda. I also don't think that he wants to be the president to lose Taiwan in a cross-border assault, because that would make him look weak. So I think he has a vested interest in not being that president. In the interest of making sure that we don't lose Taiwan, I think that there is a compelling case to be made as to why we need to continue to support. But as we've talked about, Damien, it's one thing to give weapons and equipment to Taiwan, and it's another to ensure that Taiwan has the will to fight and the ability to use those weapons and equipment. Because we have a pretty bad history of misjudging folks' willingness to use the support that we give them. I would say that recent history shows that we're as good as a coin flip at determining whether our investments in partner security funding is actually effective and they will use that funding. And we have to do much, much better for the American people than a coin flip, which means having really tough discussions with all of our partners, including Taiwan, about their plan for a society mobilization and their ability to fight and win over the long term if it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. So maybe one more from me, and then we can turn it to the audience. Going to our hemisphere, Latin America, we've seen a couple of things happening at once. One is a national defense strategy that is, reported to come out soon, which will place the Western Hemisphere in a position of primacy that we hadn't seen in past defense strategies. At the same time, we're seeing the deployment of thousands of U.S. troops across the region, and obviously these strikes against different vessels that are coming up through the Caribbean. You've done a lot of work in this space, not only in terms of pushback on war powers resolutions and other efforts that are happening in the Congress to try to constrain the administration's ability to operate here, or at the very least ask some questions about it. But then you're also the co-lead of the cartel task force on House Intel. So curious how you're seeing this issue set, counter-drug on the one hand, but then what some are arguing are extrajudicial killings on the other.
Well, a couple of things for starters. One of the things that the president always does is you state something that has a kernel of truth to it at the beginning, a problem that's grounded in a real problem, in a real issue facing Americans. And of course, his solution twists it and contorts it and doesn't create an actual solution. But it is true that our country has been devastated by fentanyl and by drugs, right? Tens of thousands of our kids a year are being killed by fentanyl. And it is true that America wants a solution, not more talk, not more process, not more committees or task forces. They want a solution, right? So that is why we see the conversion of this policy into an entertainment expedition by people like Pete Hegseth and the president, who are posting, regularly these videos of us, actually spending tens of millions of dollars to blow up what are largely wooden rafts with outboard motors on them, right? Because it's responding to that need. We know, and I know that's not going to solve the issue, that we actually do need a whole-of-government approach to this, and we need to address the precursors coming from China and other places, and that, blowing up probably unlawfully these boats coming over is not going to solve the problem. But we have to recognize that it's a problem. So that's number one. Number two, I'm also not opposed to actually having a Western Hemisphere policy.
Yep.
And making Latin America a priority, which in my lifetime, in the lifetimes before that, it never has been. That's right. We've ignored it. So that is also true. That said, this administration's he talks like an isolationist. Trump and MAGA talk like isolationists, but they actually act like imperialists.
Yeah, sometimes I wish they would be a little more isolated.
Right. So I'm very concerned about Colombia in the raging rhetorical battle between Petro and this president, because Colombia actually has been a success story. Yep. Right? It's one of the few success stories. And we had Plan Colombia that brought a whole-of-government approach that largely did turn a failing narco state into a thriving independent democracy. That's not to say that they don't have major problems and that the peace plan isn't severely strained and unraveling, but over the last 40 years, they've come a long way, right? And we are now undermining that. I'm also concerned about this administration's willingness to engage in what has so far been rhetoric, but I think is dangerously heading towards reality, regime change. Because why? We're so good at it, right? Like, we have such a great history of deciding to engage in regime change and nation building. The United States needs to get out of the regime change and nation building business, period. We're not good at it. It's not what we should be doing. There are other ways of securing our national security and delivering for the American people and making sure that we address chaos and instability and threats to our country. This president, of course, is doing the opposite.
I mean, his MAGA supporters didn't vote for that, Didn't vote for
They did
regime
not.
change. So how do you see the politics of this, especially up on the Hill?
I think Donald Trump has an element of hubris and confidence now where he thinks he can just control his supporters and his base, even if he's doing something that is historically very unpopular, and that he can control the information space and tell people exactly what he wants to tell them and cut off any alternative narrative. I mean, we obviously see that with freedom of speech and freedom of press and them shutting press off out of the Pentagon and a variety of similar measures they've taken across government.
Yeah, okay. Well, on that cheery note, let's turn it over to the audience and open it up for questions. Sorry, 1 second, then we'll go back.
Thank you for your comments.
And sorry, if you could please identify yourself.
Sure. My name's Diana Horvat. I'm not in politics. I'm an architect. I have a question. You touched on it.
Non-politicos are very welcome in this discussion. As I've already established, we're casting a wider net.
Okay. You touched on numerous things, and how do we fix the information gap and the alternative facts that are being offered, and how do we stop the egregious behavior? What is it going to take?
Well, this is, once again, a major role for Congress to legislate on AI and on the impact of social media, particularly for our children. There is unbelievable support across this country for an agenda to be serious on the impact of phones and social media on our children. Right? I'm a parent of a 15-year-old and 12-year-old, and it is excruciatingly difficult to raise children in America today for a lot of reasons, but in large part because of the influence of digital access in the social media space. So there are a number of bills, bipartisan bills, that go towards dangerous algorithms, both in terms of transparency and disclosure, but also some that outright prohibit the use of those algorithms, and that also propose pretty large restrictions on kids' ability to access social media and devices, many of which I support, and many Americans, particularly parents, also support. So that's one on the information space. Second is the impact of deepfakes and generative AI on our political system. There is no federal law that actually can address the issue of deepfakes within our politics right now, and we're seeing it happen. Right? We're seeing the videos already, and it's going to get exponentially worse in the years ahead. So we have to come up with guardrails legislatively that will address that.
Let's go up front.
Abby Hausliner, Financial Times. Congressman, I have two questions, actually. I have many, but I'll just ask two. First, in your vision, are there any circumstances in which the U.S. should work with autocrats and warlords, and what are those circumstances? My second question, unrelated, or maybe related. President Trump obviously recently has managed to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza. That tenuous ceasefire is holding at this moment. He has 3 aides, soon to be 4, deployed to Israel. CENTCOM has just set up a monitoring center, and Trump has this 20-point plan that it looks like his administration is trying to move forward with. If President Crow was suddenly in the White House right now, what would you be doing differently in respect to Gaza?
Yeah, Abby, first off, no, I don't believe we should be cutting deals with autocrats and dictators, short-term deals, because I think that undermines longer-term strategy and it undermines the interests of the American people. We should engage with them to assert pressure on them for reform, right? We always should have common cause with free people or people who want to be free. And if engaging with countries asserts that pressure and as a way of start pushing them towards reform and openness. I'm always in favor of talking and trying to push people in a better direction. On the Israel-Gaza front, I obviously want this peace deal to stick. It's extremely tenuous right now. It is a good thing that the fighting has largely stopped because the suffering was just unbearable. Ultimately, what needs to happen is a pathway towards a two-state solution. The Palestinians need self-determination, the ability to live in safety and dignity, just as the Israelis do. Until that commitment is made, and there's zero pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu by this administration to make that commitment, but until that commitment is made, I'm afraid that we just are kicking the can down the road to the next conflict, the next conflagration. So that ultimately has to be the solution to it.
So let's go. We have a question from online.
From online, in 2029, after 3 more years of this administration, how can we build more resilient and effective foreign policy institutions for the future?
Well, I think it goes to what I outlined in my initial remarks. We have to be serious about doing the things that historically we have said that we are going to do. Right? I'm not a proponent of building something new doesn't mean we throw out everything that actually is just and right. Because there are many things that are just and right. Rules, standards, alliances and partnerships. These are things that still enjoy significant support by the American people because they know that having friends matters and makes us safer. But what I am saying is we need to actually live by our own rules and have consistency in doing so. And then we have to change the face of our national security infrastructure. Right? This goes to the last point. Americans simply do not see themselves in many of their leaders right now. And until they do, and until they think that it's accessible or know that it's accessible and it's responsive to them, we're going to continue to end up with the perverse results that we're seeing.
Eric Schmidt with the New York Times, Congressman. Just before we came in today, Secretary Hegseth announced that there's been an 8th strike against an alleged drug boat, this time, however, in the Eastern Pacific, not in the Caribbean. You sit on the House Intelligence Committee. Are you and your colleagues being briefed on the precise locations of these strikes, who's in these boats, and what threat they actually pose to the United States, as the President has said?
Yeah, I've been briefed on the first 2 strikes, but seen as though the House majority has deemed to shut down the House of Representatives during a government shutdown. There have been no briefings, there's no oversight, and it's one of the many consequences of this unacceptable shutdown. Americans deserve better, and their Congress needs to show up and actually start operating, and the majority has the ability to make that happen. Because I do have the same questions you implied in your question. You know, who are we striking, right? And if these are narco-terrorists, as Secretary Hegseth purports, then why did we just repatriate 2 of them back to their country of origin, if they're such bad guys, right? What are we doing with this money? Like, I know the general amount of money we're spending, right? This is a massive effort. The assets that have been aligned into the Caribbean, pulled from Europe, pulled from the Pacific. This is costing American taxpayers close to hundreds of millions at this point. We're going to get close to that number soon. That's right. And Americans deserve to know what benefit we're getting out of that massive investment.
Okay, we've got time for one more.
Thank you. My name is Jared Smith. I'm from With Honor. Our organization just partnered with Gallup to introduce a poll that found that over 80% of Americans think that military experience is one of the top qualities that they look for when voting for elected officials. We also work very closely with the 37 members of the 4 Country Caucus, all of whom are military veterans. How important do you think veteran experience and perspective is when talking about a new vision for our foreign policy?
I think it's important. I think service is important, right? And that can take a lot of different forms. It doesn't have to be in uniform, right? There are people that I know that have served in Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, Civilian Conservation Corps, in the military. I think what's important is that if you want someone to lead, or if you're going to entrust somebody with political power, that they have actually shown at some point in their life that they can lead, right? And that they're interested in servant leadership and just not climbing up the rungs of the ladder to the next best job, right? I happen to be, I have this knack for like always drawing the short straw for getting special assignments in the House. I was an impeachment manager, and I leaded the response to the Afghanistan withdrawal, the investigation. I've done a number of things. My most recent assignment is that I'm the lead recruiter for House Democrats for the midterms. So my job is actually to go around the country and to find those candidates that are going to flip districts, as I did in 2018, and win. So what I see and what I know to be true from my own experience is that people are thirsty for real servant leadership. Not just a slogan, not just a bumper sticker, but people who have actually built something, served, done something in their life outside of politics that show they can work across a broad coalition, they can bring people in with diverse views and make something happen, right? And that certainly can mean military leadership as well as others. So it's very important.
Sorry, Billy, do we have time for one more maybe? Right here.
Thanks. My name is Tom Mealy. I'm a former colleague of Damien's at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff and done other things around town over the years. I wonder if we, that is you, are not overinterpreting the lessons of the forever wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, which were, as you said, were efforts at regime change to effect some kind of complicated outcome. We've done simpler good wars over time. World War II, kicking Iraq out of Kuwait back in the 1990s pretty quickly. What would be an occasion for the U.S. to put boots on the ground in a foreign country, if not in Ukraine today, in the just war that you described in your opening remarks?
Yeah, certainly World War II. You look at our other military interventions, and in Haiti and in the Balkans and the first Gulf War and in Panama, and almost all of those are actually stories of restraint, as much as they are stories of the use of power. Right? We set very real limits, time and scope limits on those interventions, and then we left. Right? And our failures are largely stories of when we didn't have those limits and when the accountability loop that I talked about failed. So, I mean, those examples of the successes, if you will, are largely examples of restraint, limited time, limited scope, and direct connection to the interests of the American people, right? Whether it's rescuing U.S. citizens, whether it's helping our economy, whether it's addressing autocracy or the oppression of free people, of which we had common cause with. All valid and just reasons, but limited and constrained with transparency and accountability. I think those are the key hallmarks.
Well, we're up on time now. I really want to thank you, Congressman. You've really provided a inspiring yet sober vision for how the United States should position itself in the world. I think that we're truly fortunate that you keep on grabbing these short straws because we need your leadership now more than ever. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien.